All right. So welcome everyone to the first session in the afternoon, Data Modeling with Couchbase Mobile 2.0. It's actually going to be followed by 3 other sessions, which are going to be using a similar application to the one I'm going to show in a bit. And right after this one, we'll have the develop session. Can everyone hear me right? Or is that not loud enough or too loud? It's fine, okay. Just let me know, because sometimes I don't realize if I'm talking too quietly. It's hard to know with that mic, so just raise your hand. So the develop session is going to be specifically about the 2.0 API. And then after that, at 3:15, there's going to be a session on a pretty exciting new feature, which I don't want to reveal here, but you'll have to come for that as well. And then at the end of the day, if you're still up for it, we'll be talking about query and full text search in the 2.0 API. All right, so right now, let's imagine that you've got to develop an application. The first thing you have to do is get your team together, back-end, front-end, mobile developers, and agree to a specific data model that's going to be implemented in your apps. And when you're using Couchbase Mobile, you have to think about 2 things when you're designing your data model. The data itself, but the security you want to apply on the model as well. So the application I'll show is just a simple to-do application, which has lists, and within those lists, there are tasks which have images on them. All of this data is replicated to the device on the embedded database, and I'll show you a quick demo here. So I've got the iPhone 7 emulator here running from my laptop, and I've got an iPhone device here plugged into QuickTime, which then shows the screen on the right. So I've got a list called NYC, and I've shared it with user 2. And so you see that the other device here has access to it. So I can add a task. Obviously, the most interesting event is lunch. But then once I've created that, it looks like it's already not working. Okay, let's check the network real quick. Oh, okay. Now I'm not connected on the right Wi-Fi, so that's not going to synchronize. The way I've got it set up here is I've got my sorry? Yeah, to the wrong cloud, that's it. But to make sure I didn't run into issues, I've got my laptop plugged into the Ethernet cable, which is then doing internet sharing. And so the device has to actually connect to my laptop's Wi-Fi, which is called My Network. Okay. So the device that was on the other network, the phone, the phone was connected to the internet. It was just on a different network. So when you change the network, the device knows about it, and so the Couchbase Lite will try to reconnect. So you see that the list that was on that device got pushed to the server, which is running on my laptop, and then the simulator on the left got the document. And just to show you that those 2 users are logged in as 2 different users. One is user 1 and the other is user 2. So that's the extent of the application. Let's now start from the beginning. Let's imagine you have just one requirement is to have lists and the other is to have tasks. And you might start off with tables. And if you wanted to have users in those lists, you'd have a user's property, which could be an array. When you start doing data syncing with access control, you introduce the notion of a user, and we call it a sync gateway user. It's defined on the server side, and the clients log in as their particular user. So then you translate that model into JSON. And you notice that we introduced a new property called the type, which is used to differentiate between documents, a lot like a table. Oh, sorry about that. Was that like that since the beginning? No. I'm not sure. What, in system preferences? Oh, I see, okay. So I need to do this. Yeah, but oh, okay. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So the type property, as I said, is used to differentiate between your documents. After that comes the underscore ID property. It's Couchbase Mobile specific, and every property that starts with an underscore is Couchbase Mobile specific. The ID is unique and cannot obviously change, and that's why it's usually useful for relationships between documents. So that's a very simple data model, and let's see how we would implement. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so you could do either. There's a method on Couchbase Lite to query a document by ID, and if that document doesn't exist, to return a new instance. And actually, when you persist the document, you can specify one yourself, or you can let the database generate one for you. But if you specify one and it already exists, then obviously it will return an error. So. Yeah, true. I mean, generally, yeah, we recommend to have keys that you define yourself with prefixes, and so you can use a view query to prefix match on the part of the key you want to match, or you could have the document type as the first part of the key, and then you could have the user name or the list ID or whatever. But in a mobile application, you're going to have to query on other document properties very often anyway. So it's not like you need everything to be on the ID. I mean, actually, this afternoon in the Nickel and FTS talk, we'll be querying documents on all sorts of keys into arrays and dictionaries. So yeah, you can do one or the other. That's up to you. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna switch back to the application, and I showed you the end result with the sync function that was already implemented to share lists between users and invite users to lists. But let's start with something that's really just basic. So by the way, when you start Sync Gateway, you have to specify a config file, and it's a JSON file, and so that's what I'm using here. And this JSON file is just specifying 4 users, a password on those users, and then it's specifying roles. You can also assign users to roles, and also, yeah, so the moderator user as a password, and also a role of moderator, which is then defined in the roles dictionary. The actual end result is something like this, where the sync function is really long. That's the sync function that implements your access control. But we're going to build it up here in this talk. Okay. So once you start Syn Gateway with no sync function, and you open the admin UI on localhost 4985, you'll see this, which is just function. Is it big enough? I'll put it bigger. Yeah. Just function that takes a document and then calls the channel method with doc.channels as a parameter. That function is called every time a document is sent to the server. So when you create a list, it's going to take that document in and then run your access control on it and generate some rules. When you create a task in that list, it's going to run that function again. Just going to delete this one. So here I'm connected to that instance that has no sync function. It has the default sync function. So here on the lower part of the screen, I've got a curl request, which is sending a document directly to Syn Gateway on the REST API. And it's authenticating as user one, so the same user logged in the app. And it's sending the data model that we've defined in the presentation. So the type is a task list and a name and an owner. But if we send this out, we'll notice that nothing gets pulled down. And that's because your sync function doesn't know what to do about this document precisely. So what we will do is delete this here. There's only like 4 or 5 different methods you can use in the sync function. So instead of presenting them like one by one, I'll just use 3 in this presentation and explain them while I'm using them. So the first one is channel, and it takes a string, which you can think of a channel as a container where you have documents inside of them, and then you give users access to those channels. So a bit like routing, where when you send a document to a specific endpoint on your API, it's going to persist it in a database, in a document, and the application is going to enforce which user has access to that. This is all done in the sync function. So in terms of application logic, if we had multiple lists in our app, chances are we probably want each list to be isolated in its own channel, right? So a way to map a list to a channel is to use something unique in the list document. And if we look at this, what's unique there is the _ID property. So we call doc._ID. And then when we reload that, we'll see that the document we just inserted again is mapped to that channel. But it still doesn't appear on the device because that's only routing. It's not access control. It's not read permission. So the second method we'll use is access, which takes 2 arguments: the user we want to grant this access to, and the channel we want to allow the user to have access to. The owner property here is here, so we can use it. And then the channel is just the same as this one. Okay, so now if I add a new one, yeah, I can just keep adding new lists, and they get sent to Syn Gateway, and because we call access and we're logged in with the same user on the phone, it then pulls the documents. Okay. So that's how you would implement. So, okay, one thing I wanted to say is notice the owner property. I mean, from a data model point of view, you would probably need it because it's you want to know who created the list, but it's also used for security. So in this case, I mean, if the username wasn't on the document somewhere, you wouldn't be able to make sure that user has access to that channel. So some properties, they get used for pure data and for access, and some properties may be used only for data, and some other properties may be used only for access. Yeah? Should we take question now or at the end? I'll take it now, yeah. Could you just repeat it a bit loudly? Because I do. A bucket. Two different things. So like a bucket is purely Couchbase server. It's a concept on Couchbase server, and a channel is a concept on Couchbase Mobile. So I'll show you here the configuration of Syn Gateway. We use Walrus here, which specifies that it persists the document in memory, but we could have we can instead persist the document to Couchbase server, and then the way we would specify where in Couchbase server is by specifying the bucket name, right? So let's say we created a bucket on Couchbase server called mobile. We would then specify in Syn Gateway in the config to persist the documents to the mobile bucket. That's it. I mean, that's as far as it goes in terms of how one relates to the other. Syn Gateway persists documents to buckets. But there's no access control for end users implemented in buckets. It's pure storage, whereas with mobile, channels are an essential part for access control, right? So it's, yeah, two different things. Okay. So another requirement of the application might be to have relationships between our documents. So the task would have a reference to the ID of the list it belongs to. That's same as in any other database relationships. But where it gets a bit different is if you want to share something with another user, like on that screenshot. So we would have two ways of doing that. The first one is we could embed the usernames of the users we want to share the list with on the document. So on the bottom here, we would say that that list is shared with user 1 and user 2. That's a way of doing it, and it just depends on your application which way you may want to go with. But the downsides of this approach is that if you have thousands and thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, that array is going to grow really, really rapidly. And every user will have to replicate that big document, which may not be desirable. And privacy as well. If user 3 got invited to the list, a requirement may be that they shouldn't know who else is invited to the list. So even if you don't show the list of users on the UI, it's still here on the document. So if somebody wanted to have a look at it, they could. So instead, we would create a third document type, a task list.user in the orange rectangle. And it has a username property and a task list dictionary. So the username property is the user we want to invite, and the task list.owner is the owner of the list. And that's a join. It's like doing a join, but for access control. That way we remove the users array from the task list. And yeah. So let's have a look at how we can modify that syn function to allow another user to access the list. So those two statements at the moment would apply to any document type. So we need to specify that we only want those rules to apply to a document of type task lists. Okay, so then this time I'm not going to create the document from the command line. I'll just invite the user through the app. So when we invite a user here, it's going to be, let's see, what's the type of that document again? Task list.user. So we'll create another block. And now, what do we want to do in that block? So let's see, that orange document is a join between the user we want to invite and the user that owns the list. Okay, so we might use the access call again. And the first parameter is the user we want to give access to, which is username. So doc.username. And then the second is the channel we want to give the user access to. It's this channel, basically, right? But doc.id for a task list user isn't really what we're looking for. We're looking for this property, which is stored here. So it should be task list.id. Okay. Sorry? I didn't hear that, sorry. Second to last line. Oh, yeah, right. Really good catch. Thanks. Cool. Okay, I'm just going to delete all those lists because it's getting harder. Oh. Okay. And now I'll create NYC2 and give user 2. So now, yeah, if we hadn't written this line in the sync function, the NYC2 wouldn't have appeared on the user 2's device. Okay. Now, another functionality of the app is to have attachments, so you can take a picture of the task you want to complete. In this case, it's the best groceries list I've ever seen with amazingly detailed pictures. Each picture is stored offline on the device, and in the data model, it gets translated as a underscore attachments property in bold here. In 2.0, this is changing slightly. So instead of having the underscore attachments property on the left, we're going to have the attachment name straight away, and then inside of it, the underscore CBL type, and in this case, we're calling it blob. So we've redefined the attachments API to be called blob, and we'll go in detail about this in the next talk. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. So anytime there's an underscore, it means that it was generated by the library. So when you create a document, let's say this one I created from the command line. I didn't really specify an underscore ID, and it generated one for me. And the name of that property is underscore ID. I actually could have said underscore ID and then specified an ID. But you have to know that when you use an underscore, it's a concept that's reserved for Couchbase Lite. So attachments is the same. When in the Couchbase Lite API, you create an attachment, it's going to actually translate into JSON as underscore attachment because it's a concept that is defined by Couchbase Lite. The type property isn't. You could call your document types foobar. Like you could use any property you want to differentiate between entities of your model. But traditionally, people use type. So that's just like a user convention, I guess. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, attachments in terms of data model are straightforward. You don't really have to do much, but it's good to include them in your spec for everyone to know. Then the last feature I wanted to show is the roles. So that's not so much related to data model, but it's good to know about it. So let's say that here I'm user 1, and user 1 hasn't got any particular role, but actually the user called mod has a role of moderator, right? So if I log out of this user, so now let's create a list on the user 2's device. I'm going to call it user 2. It doesn't appear on the moderator's device. So what would we do to change that? In the sync function, when a list document gets processed, so the task list, that first parameter is the username, but if you prefix it with a role keyword and then specify the role name, that actually is going to grant all users with the role moderator access to the channel. All right, so it's user 2 is still not on user 1 or on the moderator's device, sorry, because it was already persisted and replicated. So this, when you change the sync function, it doesn't retroactively process all the documents again. To do that, you would have to call an underscore resync endpoint. So you have to take the database offline, call underscore resync. It goes through all the documents again, and then bring the database back online, and then devices will get the documents that the newly defined sync function. But we're not doing that in the presentation because it's a maintenance task usually that you perform on the back end. So instead, I'm just going to create a new list. Here. And I'm just going to log out. Yeah. So the reason I had to log out is because when you click deploy to server, it stops Syn Gateway. And so the clients that are connected through a WebSocket or a long poll query, they're using a session ID, like an authorization header. And so when you stop Syn Gateway, that session ID isn't valid anymore, so they won't get the update. So I had to log out and log back in after deploying to Syn Gateway. How are we doing on time? Okay. So that's, I'll just recap a few things. So yeah, maybe I should have showed this slide at the beginning in case you were super new to Couchbase Mobile, but essentially your Couchbase Lite database holds all of your data. Syn Gateway acts as the middleman server, middle tier, with the security implemented in the sync function, and the storage is all on Couchbase server. And in your sync function, you write your write permissions, your validation, your routing, and your read permissions, and that affects your data model. That's the admin UI, and it's quite practical when you're making lots of changes and you want to see how it affects your data model and who gets access to what. And yeah, my name is James, and I'm a tech writer at Couchbase. Those are my details if they're big enough. If you want to get in touch, you can send me an email, or we can chat after the presentation. And I think that was it. Thank you very much. So I'll take questions if anyone has any question. Yeah. With 2.0, yeah. Yeah, so when you open a database with the 2.0 library, or 1.x database with the 2.0 library, it automatically upgrades all of the documents to the new schema. So, yeah. Sorry? Yeah, so the replication protocol has changed in 2.0, but Sync Gateway will still support, for a foreseeable future, the 1.x replication protocol. So you can have applications out there that are running 1.x and ones that are running 2.0, and it will still replicate with Sync Gateway back and forth. So, yeah. Yeah. On the client side, in the application? Oh, yeah. So all of the sync function we wrote was on the server on Sync Gateway. So if the device, obviously, when a user creates a task, the sync function isn't going to run until that document is sent to the server. So there's no way on the client of knowing, because that device could be offline, right? And if it's offline, then it could be a long time before it gets sent to the server. So it's on the application side, you have to write some, validation to make sure that a user isn't creating a document that isn't valid. So, for example, if I create a list and share it with another user, the second user, we may decide that he's not allowed to delete the list, right? And if we don't do anything, the user will delete the list, and the Sync Gateway will say, no, you can't delete the list. But the best thing would have been to have a pop-up on the app to say you can't delete the list. And so that logic is purely implemented on the app, in the application code. And so that's where your data model becomes quite important as well. Yeah. You would have to say, okay, I'm logged in as user 2, and I'm trying to delete the list of user 1. That's not allowed, so I'll show a pop-up to the user. Because the nature of Couchbase Mobile is that it's built for applications that are sometimes available, sometimes offline, so it can't be always connected, obviously. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I think so, actually. Yeah, I think it's only because we're using Walrus. Yeah. So Walrus is an in-memory bucket, which is just for development. So when you kill Sync Gateway and it's using Walrus and you restart it, it's actually starting from scratch. So your session document doesn't exist anymore. But if you used Sync Gateway, it would get the session document that's in the bucket. So yeah, that's why. Yeah. Yeah, you can have a fairly complex sync function, but you can actually compose, so you can write functions in your sync functions and then call them throughout. So, if you had common operations for validations or making sure Yeah, you can. There are patterns where you can actually minimize the complexity and have abstract common things that are very common, and then put them into one function, and then call that function throughout. There's also, sorry, I don't have the link right here, but there's a community project called Sync2, and they've built a lot of utility methods for the sync function. So it's a pretty cool project. It's on the forums.couchbase.com. There's a thread on there about Sync2, and that's the name of the tool. And I think every month or so there's an update to that tool. So that would be a good place to look if you want to have fairly complex functionality. Yeah. Sorry? The sync function. Yeah, that's all in the config file, and you could have a repository just for your config file, and that way when somebody submits a change, you can actually have a thorough review, because changing your sync function is changing a lot of things, so it's probably good to keep it in source control. And if you want to go really sort of the extra mile, you could have a sort of a continuous deployment setup where on this, on a staging environment, it would deploy your new sync function for you automatically. So yeah, definitely have it in source control, I would say. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, and I'll see you around. Cheers.